Thank you. And I heard, can everybody hear me okay? I heard from the last panel that the panelists need to make sure to speak into the microphones well, so everybody can hear you. I would like to start by thanking the PCHRE for having this session with the staff and faculty, and also President Castro. And also, we would like to have you go ahead and introduce yourselves and think about how, or if you could talk about how you identify and what do you consider your 2 or 3 primary identities. So, I was thinking about how would I answer that, and I guess I would say I'm a heterosexual woman, which I don't really think about all that much, I guess. I'm Japanese American and I'm a single mom. And I think, it's those intersectionality pieces that we're kind of looking at and how they all cross, how all of those roads and paths cross. So, Dr. Bynum, would you start off?
Sure, my name is John Bynum. I'm in the English department. I'm also a member of the LGBT plus Allies Network on campus. How I identify, I would say that I identify as gay or queer, depending on, I don't know, sort of how I feel in any particular moment or how I wake up that day. But I've sort of come out into both of those identities, and if we want to discuss the term queer or its relationship to the word gay and lesbian, we might be able to do that in the Q&A. I also identify as white and male, but I should say, like you, it's not something I think about a lot. So when I thought about that quite a bit, and I know that I'm white and I'm male, but I'm not asked to think about that very often. So in other words, other people don't cause me to reflect upon that as much. I try to reflect on it as a matter of trying to be aware. But I will say that one identity that I think I hold onto and that informs a lot of what I do is my ex-Mormon sort of Western U.S. Background. And I find that those values are often values that I find myself either chafing against or embracing, depending on what those sort of elements of my heritage are. So.
And Dakota?
My name is Dakota Draconi. I am a member of the Fresno State NCBI team and also faculty in women's studies and social work departments. It's always kind of complicated for me when I'm asked how I identify because it tends to depend on where I am. So I think for the sake of brevity in this format, I'm a child abuse activist, I'm an LGBT activist, I am faculty, as I said. I've only newly begun to identify as faculty. I'm queer, and queer is my sexual identity, my gender identity, and my political identity all wrapped up into one. And I don't really identify as white, although I appear to be white, and I get that, and I do recognize that I'm a beneficiary of white privilege as a result of that. But I'm 25% Native American, and I honor that part of my heritage. And let's see. So, and in terms of my spiritual identity, some people would call me Christian. I don't like the word Christian. I feel like the label Christian has been hijacked by people who don't represent this man that I call Christ. My 2 or 3 primary identities would be my sexual identity, my gender identity, and my spiritual identity. I think that's it.
And Melissa?
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Melissa Knight, and I teach in women's studies. I've been here since 1999. And I'm also an activist and in the community as consultant and coach for a number of organizations, and I've been doing that forever and 2 days. And I identify first and foremost as a human being on this planet who is concerned with changing the planet for the 2 other human beings' souls that I brought into the world. And everything I do is connected to that. So the rest of that is I identify as a twice adopted, queer, identified, cisgendered woman who's high yellow of African descent, a mother. I know you said 2 or 3, but that's always difficult.
2 or 3.
A person who identifies also as sex positive in terms of my, queer is my political identity, and my gender identity, of course, is the cisgendered woman. Sex positive culture is about how I relate to people and how I view agency. And, oh, am I not doing that? Goodness gracious. Okay. I also have what some people call a disability. I consider it a gift, and that's ADHD. And I'm the first person in my family to go to college and grad school. And what else do I have on my happy little list? Working class, blue collar parents. Small
Very-
town.
Very good. And Carlos?
Let me make sure. Can you hear me? Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Carlos Diaz, and I work as a disability management specialist here on campus in the Office of Services for Students with Disabilities, and I'm also a licensed marriage and family therapist in the community. I have a private practice. So how do I identify? It's kind of an interesting question because I could just say that I identify as gay, but that doesn't quite encompass my whole story. As an adult, a young adult at 20, I was married. To a wonderful individual for 20 years. Halfway through the marriage, I began identifying as bisexual, so that was something that was of difficulty for my partner. She didn't know how to process that, understand that. In many ways, throughout our marriage, it was kind of tended to be the elephant in the room that we didn't talk about because it was just very painful for her, but I was committed to her and cared for her very much. 4 years ago, we came to the decision to divorce, and it wasn't primarily because of my sexual orientation, but a whole accumulation of things. We had changed. We got married as kids, and we weren't the same people that we were then. We ended the relationship in a way that was very healthy, and I like to say ended it with good karma for each of us. So she's moved on and since has married, and I now identify as being gay. So that's one that's a very important one. Another one for me is identify as being Puerto Rican and New Yorkan, or from New York. When I moved to California in 1980, the Latino culture here was very different than what I was used to. So it's always been important for me to kind of hold on to that. I miss my food, I miss my culture, and so that's kind of like my, I identify as Latino, but more importantly, Puerto Rican. And last, I'm going to talk about one that, an identity that still tends to be a taboo in our culture. It's something that we don't talk about, and that's of a sexual abuse survivor. These experiences have all brought it together for me to do my life's work, and it's a lot of the work that I do with my clients working on sexual abuse issues, rape and incest stuff. So I worked at an agency before coming to Fresno State called Rape Counseling Services, and was blessed to be able to help people during that time. But those are my identities.
Thank you for sharing, everybody. What parts of your identities do you find most challenging to be open about on this campus?
So I have to say that I have had a very, of the identities that I mentioned earlier, I think being a gay man would be the one that would be, I think most people would assume was the most challenging. However, at Fresno State, I I've felt that it's not been challenging at all. In fact, I feel very comfortable being out. I work in a department where I feel as though it's always been not only accepted but embraced. And the work I do is often on questions of gender and sexuality, doing queer studies work. So I've never had a problem with any colleagues challenging, my ability to do that work. I've been able to develop a lesbian and gay literature course that I teach on a regular basis, on a yearly basis on campus. So I have to say that my experiences have been very good, actually at all levels of my sort of employment, I suppose, at the university for the last 15 years. Sometimes that's challenging as a member of this larger community in Fresno. And again, I haven't experienced a lot of overt homophobia in Fresno. I know a lot of people, and I agree to a certain degree that this is true, but a lot of people talk about Fresno or the Central Valley as being conservative, but I've never met with any kind of outright hostility, except once, and that was when I first moved to Fresno, and I was with my partner, and we were trying to find a place to live. It was at a time when there just weren't a lot of rentals available. So we had been told that the Tower District was a cool place to go, so we went down to the Tower District, we found a house, it looked like the house was going to be perfect. The landlord actually wouldn't rent to us because he couldn't understand why two men would be living together in the same house. And when we told him we were a gay couple, he said, well, and this was a really funny thing for him to say in retrospect, but I need people who are clean. And I thought, well, then what you need to do is get your stereotypes right. So it was this odd, kind of thing where he was dancing around this issue of and he was asking lots of questions of why two grown men are going to be living together in this house and what you plan on doing and all of this. And so that would be the most obvious instance of homophobia. Later I found out that the lesbian colleague that I'd been hired with had also been refused. He wouldn't let her rent there either. So that's the only issue. Apart from that, I think that it happens, challenges happen in much more subtle ways. My partner and I often get, and I think this is because when you live with someone for 19 years, you begin to sound alike and maybe even look alike and wear some of the same clothes, and we have to check each other as we're walking out the house. Are you going to wear that? Because I was going to wear this, and we're going to look like, and we often get sort of pegged as being brothers, but I think it's a way of other people processing, why are you two adult men who are basically the same age constantly together? And so sometimes people find ways to try and process that, and so they'll latch on to other kinds of relationships in order to make us more comfortable for them. Again, I find that more amusing than anything, but it's a challenge that they're working through, and I can see the little wheels moving in their heads, but yeah, that would be my experience sort of in a nutshell.
Thank you, John. And Dakota?
I shared with a couple of people before the panel that I am finding myself today acutely aware of my whiteness, and that doesn't happen all the time, but I think it's as a result of the conversations that we've been having today as part of this event. I find it very challenging to be open about that aspect of my identity, not because you don't know, because obviously you do, but because I have issues with it inside myself, which has nothing to do with the mood of the campus whatsoever. In terms of my other identities, I'm very open as an activist. Part of what I do is public speaking, so people know where I'm coming from, my history, they know, where I'm at now. My expression of my gender identity is relatively new in the big scheme of things. It actually began happening in my first semester here at Fresno State when I took representations of women class with Melissa, and then the next semester I took her gay and lesbian studies class, and we read a book called Stone Butch Blues. And that was at about 40 years old, the first time in my life that I came to understand that I didn't have to be either or in terms of my gender identity. Now I educate about that, so I feel kind of silly sharing that I didn't know, but I remember numerous conversations that Melissa and I had before and after class and in between classes, and every opportunity I had to pick her brain about this issue of gender identity and finding where I land in that continuum. Just learning that it was a continuum was difficult. Earth-shattering for me, but finding where I land in it. So, I mean, obviously, I'm pretty open with my gender identity today, but I find there are challenging issues related to my gender identity, and I'll save that actually for the next question. All that to say, I think the most challenging part of my identity for me to be open about on this campus or anywhere else is my spiritual beliefs. Simply because I live in a culture where I'm told I cannot be queer and Christian.
All right, thank you. Melissa?
So I would have to say that my bisexual identity as being misunderstood and either rendered invisible, or rendered objectified in a pornification type of way is really it. Folks are very, very interested in who I'm dating, and the preoccupation with so you were married to a man and then you were in a domestic partnership with a woman, and then you were dating another man, and that's really interesting. And just, this, get out of my bedroom, and, so that sense that everyone feels entitled to that, and how it's viewed as hypersexualized is an issue. And then, was it also, Dakota went into community. So community kinds of, example of something that was challenging? Or is that the next question?
That's the next question.
Okay, I'll wait.
Hang on.
I'll wait.
My turn? Okay.
Yeah.
I would say that at this point, I haven't had any challenges. Interesting story happened. I think it was about a year ago, close to a year ago. There was an event that was going on for Student Affairs, and NCBI was doing a facilitation. And while we were doing the facilitation, I'm realizing that they're going to ask, if you identify or you support a particular group, stand up. And so I'm like, okay, well, there was this inner turmoil of whether do I stand up or do I not, and then if I don't stand up, then what is that saying to me about myself, that somehow I'm ashamed of who I am. And so the moment came whether if you identify if you identify as being gay or lesbian, stand up. And so I had this belief that I was going to be the only one, and I was the only one, but it was strangely kind of liberating. I'm like, it didn't really matter, because I know I'm not the only one there, and some people may have chosen not to stand up, and that's okay. But I did it more because it was important to me to love myself, because for many years there wasn't that love that I had for myself. It was that inner critic that was just, in a lot of ways, because just kind of trying to destroy me. And so I just wasn't interested in going there anymore. If I'm taking this step, then I'm going to take it all the way. And it doesn't matter what anybody thinks, it's what's important to me. So other than that, maybe having conversations with individuals where they might throw out the statement of lifestyle choice, and it's not a lifestyle choice, and I choose at times whether I want to have a conversation about that or not, but I don't let that become a microaggression that's going to affect me as much as I did before. So yeah, that would be how I would answer that question.
Thank you. Now, the next question is, Can you share some experiences where you found it to be more challenging?
So I think that I want to be very careful about how I say this, and in my last response, it seemed, I was sort of talking about how everything seems pretty great. I mean, I'm fine, but I know that a lot of that has to do with the ways in which, while my gayness may, in some circumstances, or my queerness may, in some circumstances, be a liability, my whiteness and my maleness sort of often counterbalance that plenty. So I think that the challenge I face is my white masculine privilege. And it's not just white masculine privilege, also my able-bodiedness and all of the other identities that put me in the category of normative, I think is the way to maybe put it. My waspiness, all of those things don't really provide challenges for me. But the way that it does provide a challenge is that it prevents me from seeing what I need to see and prevents me from doing what I need to do on campus sometimes. And this morning we were having a discussion at the meet and greet about the organization that I'm part of, the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Plus Allies Network, and what we're doing to create, to perform outreach and to make sure that queers of color on campus are included. And one of the things I have to think about is, how is it that my privileges prevent me from seeing how the right ways or the right the opportunities that there are for me to reach out. So I think that those challenges, while I want to be absolutely clear that that's not oppression and that's not discrimination, but the challenge is a personal one that's sort of where I have to figure out how I negotiate privilege in such a way as to be more responsive to others.
Thank you. And Dakota?
So in terms of my sexual identity and where my sexual identity intersects with my spiritual beliefs, it was incredibly difficult for me on this campus in 2008. I was at the time in a relationship with a woman that I've been in a relationship with now for 19 years, and we had gotten married in that window where we were allowed to get married, and Proposition 8 was on the ballot. And I was a new grad student here. I had just graduated with my bachelor's degree in May, and I was in grad school, and every time I walked on campus, got accosted by Christian clubs handing out literature about Proposition 8 and encouraging people to vote in favor of Proposition 8 and to write discrimination into the Constitution of the state of California. And that was incredibly difficult. At the same time, or shortly before, I can't remember in terms of timelines, but we had quite the prolific preacher coming to the free speech area. And, this preacher was not, he didn't pick and choose who he discriminated against or spoke hate speech against. He yelled horrible things at people in wheelchairs, at queers, at women that he felt were dressed inappropriately. He shared the love, or the hate, as it was. But it was incredibly difficult for me to walk through that space because I had to walk through that space. And then, to be a part of a group, United Student Pride at the time, that was saying, how's this okay? How's this allowed? And to have administration, from my point of view, ignore the issue. And we were told by campus police that the person had reserved the area and was allowed to say whatever he wanted to say. And so a lot's changed since then. We haven't seen our lovely preacher that spews hate on campus for quite a while, but that was a very challenging time for me and a lot of other people. My greatest, most challenging experiences on this campus have to do with gendered restrooms. on this campus and off of this campus, but I have had incidents on this campus. I was just telling Francine, when I went to walk into the restroom, I always have anxiety when I'm walking up to a restroom door. I don't identify as male, I don't identify as female, I identify as pangender, I don't belong anywhere. Even on gender-neutral restrooms, you see the picture of the boy and the girl both on the door, and that's incredible, that's great, but I still am not represented there, and I always have anxiety when I'm walking towards the restroom because I have to use the women's room because that's what my driver's license says. And today, when I reached out and grabbed that door to open it, it was Francine on the other side, and I got to go, because I didn't have to have another one of those experiences. One specific experience I had on this campus, I was telling my students about yesterday. I opened the door of the restroom, and there was a girl opening the door at the same time to walk out. She saw me and went, and I literally turned around to see the axe murderer behind me, because I couldn't understand in that moment what was so terrifying about me.
Thank you for sharing. Melissa?
Thank you. So a couple of community experiences as a mom. I remember when I was in a relationship with my last female partner, and we were together for 9 years, and my son was, around 5th grade at this point, and we had lived in that space in that neighborhood for years, and he came home one day and he couldn't play at the neighbor's house, and I looked at Terry and she looked at me and I went, okay, well, it wasn't the black thing, they've known that, so it was okay. They've decided that they're in our bedroom, and they're the gay couple, and we can't have our kid playing with that kid anymore. So having that conversation with your son, why you can't play with someone else, and what that means when people are discriminated against you and you're a kid. And I think he was actually a little younger than that, because it was in 5th grade that there were kids who were just shouting different things on campus, and teachers and faculty and staff at the school not really knowing what to do about it. And so a student got sent to the office for saying that another kid was lesbian, and he said, but Mom, she didn't even know what it meant. His little face of, I don't get why she got in trouble for saying lesbian. And, so dealing with children in that. Part of that also was the community culture and this small town, very conservative, yes. All of the things that Dakota was saying with Prop 8 on campus and off campus, and my family is very active in a very large church in town, one of the larger, very upscale, if there is such a thing for black churches, community, right? They're very bougie, very bourgeoisie. And every Sunday they were passing out these Yes on 8 signs, and at the church, and they'd have them though in the foyer. So they would all be in church, and and I would go into the foyer, and my activism of the moment was was to keep fewer of those on people's lawns. So I would go and collect them while they're in the actual pews inside. All their happy little signs were for right after people grab those on their way out the door to their cars, and I would scoop up as many as I could every Sunday and keep them. And again, with my kid, explaining as he's seeing classmates on the corners with parents, why their parents are teaching them hate. On campus, it's more, other than what I've already spoken about, my gender identity, and just as a faculty member, and I think students, and John was dealing with some of that with, on the student panel earlier with a student, Jackie, who spoke about it, an incident that she had, but John's response was about the potential where that faculty member was and disrespect. And that's something that I get quite regularly on campus from white male students, from white female students that really come at the perspective of you shouldn't be standing there and I shouldn't have to do what you, I regularly have students change my assignments regularly and feel justified in doing so and explain to me in this really matter-of-fact yet haughty kind of way that they think it's better that way. And it seemed rather perplexed when I challenged and say, you know, I just don't see you taking in a downtown Philadelphia map if you were asked for a, you know, ancient Macedonia, you know, map. You wouldn't do that. So why do you feel justified in doing that in my classroom? And there are students every semester who do that, and that's incredibly frustrating. I had a student who turned in an assignment that was so over the top, clearly an FU in the nth degree, and just over the top. And then I looked at it just a million different ways, trying to see something else, you know, and I just finally said, yeah, that's what that is. And it was absolutely an F. And then the student wanted to, of course, challenge that he got an F, right? And so I had a conversation with the student, and there were a couple of emails, and he, in an email, said that he came every day and he turned in something and for this big, huge project. It was a semester-long project. And he knows that it wasn't an A-level project, and it wasn't even a B-level project, but, you know, it absolutely deserves a C. And when I spoke with him on the phone, I said, so what you're saying is if this was a multiple choice test, as long as you marked something, you really, no, no. So, but that's normative for the students in that positionality, that they feel absolutely entitled to undermine my authority in the classroom on a regular basis. And a colleague that I shared an office with for about a decade is in Boise, white activist colleague, and we would often discuss teaching the same classes side by side, how there was just that difference between what students would almost say to her, but they would actually say to me, you know, or almost challenge her in that way. And there were times even when she would call something before I would call it, you know, and say, you know, that's, and I'm still trying to look beyond that, and you know, because it was both my blackness and my being a woman, and then that, in terms of intersectionality, leads to, for me, that sense of not ever being enough. As a high yellow black woman, I'm not ever quite black enough for some folks, and yet I'm not white enough, and I'm actually mixed race, but I don't identify as such because I'm adopted. I know that what my parents ethnically were, but I was raised in black families. So, and I was raised to understand the beauty and breadth of color and depth of character and within our community, yet dealing constantly with within friend groups and church groups and community groups and then work groups across my life. And it happened on campus a couple of years ago, where there were a couple of there were a few situations where the challenges were coming from colleagues on campus, and it was very clearly a colorism kind of thing. But that other piece of my sexual orientation identity was, I could see the question on their faces. Why are you doing this when we thought you were this? And there was that piece. And why can't you just stay within that nice little box that we've crafted for you? Because that works for us. So.
Thank you. Carlos, I'm going to skip down to another question for you. What would have made a difference for you on this campus that would have helped eliminate barriers?
I don't really have anything that I have for that, but here are my thoughts. I haven't been out probably as much as some of these individuals, so I'm still kind of new and newbie to it, so I'm still learning. What I would say, not necessarily helpful for me, but more for the students. We talk about diversity and inclusion, and I recently met with a student. I obviously won't mention the name, but this is a student who is transgendered and going through the process. And the student was having. I was out to lunch, and one of my student assistants knocked on my door and told me, "Your student is here. They want to be called by their new name." And so I already knew of the student, I knew of the struggle, so obviously I wanted to embrace that and make her feel comfortable. But so while we were meeting, I went about letting her know, we're going to change the name on the system. We're going to make sure that they don't keep identifying you as your former name. And then she just seemed to have just a wave of relief kind of came over her. And it just kind of struck me because then she started talking about the challenges that she's having on campus because the campus isn't able to change her name because it's the legal name. And if we're talking about wanting to be a campus that embraces diversity or inclusion, this is something that we need to take a look at. And I think that we're taking steps towards that, but this is another step that we can back up the talk that we keep putting out there. This is a way to put it into action. And showing the community, the LGBTQ community, that we really do embrace them. So that's how I would answer that.
All right, and John, can you talk a little bit about that also? What would have made a difference for you on this campus that would have helped eliminate the barriers?
I want to echo what Carlos said, and that is that I don't know that there's anything personal that I needed to have changed. I think that I've navigated my way through the entire process, through tenure, promotion, all of that, without much standing in my way. Or if there have been things standing in my way, I didn't know about it. I'm happy not to know about it. But I think when it comes to advocating for others, especially our students, there are real barriers in place right now. And I think the preferred name issue is a big one. The story I'll tell is, and I think of myself, I came out, in the early 90s, and I came out into activism, and I came out and immediately joined Queer Nation and ACT UP and all of this, sort of organizations that were activist organizations working in Salt Lake City, Utah, of all places, and really confronting, issues. And so I feel like I'm fairly aware of things, but I often have to learn, too, that, and things strike me. So anyway, some years ago, I'm teaching a class, and I have two students on my roster, and they were identifying as different names, which I corrected completely, and it was because they were presenting in terms of gender differently than they had been assigned gender or understood to be embodied at birth. And so, I was like, that's fine, we're moving from there. I had to learn, okay, so you don't read first names first day of class, you read last names and then let the students tell you what the name is so that, so I've been coming up with things. But when it comes to sort of certain institutional things that prevent us from being able to support those students, for example, in Blackboard, those students were not participating in mandatory assignments on Blackboard. I didn't know why. And I thought, well, they're just going to fail the class. What can I do? I want to support them. I want to help them. And it wasn't until partway through the semester that I realized, wait a minute, they're not participating in Blackboard because they're legal name, their birth name, is going to show up with every post that they create. That's a huge issue. I mean, that's a huge issue in terms of student success. So I think that we have to identify those, and I know that the university is taking steps right now to identify those problems, but I think we have to really move forward, identify those barriers that prevent our students from being able to succeed. And and we also have to understand that this isn't an imposition, this isn't a difficulty. I mean, this isn't a matter of, oh, I have to change it's a matter of respect and inclusion. It's a matter of decency. No one would challenge me if I said I want to be called by my middle name. That would just be sort of understood as a matter of course. So why we get our hackles up when a student has decided, I'm going to identify by a different name that you
Right.
think I shouldn't have.
Right.
So.
Now, I'm trying to be mindful of our time here, and it's time for we need to do a little Q&A. Does anybody here have a question for the panelists here? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, I guess this is directed for John, but how does a person write linearly if there's so many things that intersect? Like, it's really hard to I can write in a journal or I can write even in classes, essay field, but I have ADHD and dyslexia, which I learned to work with it. But at the same time, it's still hard to just pick a point and stick your finger well, if I think about this, and I'm walking. It's just, I can't keep it's more like an umbrella than a ladder. It's very hard to conclude or
Are you asking me to respond to that? I think that, I try to, I think more of us think in those terms than we think about thinking as linear, and especially academic thinking as being something that's linear. But we have to understand that there are ways in which, and there are topics around that don't lend themselves to linear kinds of thinking. I think the question of identity is one of them. I think we do a disservice when we think about our identities as strictly being a linear process, or a hierarchical one. Here's my X identity, here's this other part of it, here's Y, here's Z, here's A, and they all just kind of clip on like beads in a necklace or something. And in fact, they don't. They don't just unclip easily. So I think when we're talking about these issues, it becomes especially difficult to try and sort of sort through how do we come up with the right approach. And maybe the linear approach isn't the right one. Maybe the circular approach or the associative approach is a way to talk about complicated issues in academia too. So.
I'm going to go ahead and go to our final prompt. I'm going to start with Dakota this time. If you would like to share a perspective you bring or experience you've had to help us better understand you, perhaps related to a community to which you belong, your sexual identity or gender identity, or your family or cultural background, we would encourage you to do that now.
Thank you. I think the perspective that I bring, that I'd like most to get across to you, not just to understand me better. In fact, I don't really care if you understand me, but I care if you understand your colleagues, your coworkers, your students, your loved ones, and that is the fact that gender identity, sexual identity do not exist as binaries. They exist on a continuum. I've seen a lot of female signatures lately with preferred pronouns in them. And I've seen them say preferred pronoun she, her, preferred pronoun he, him. Well, neither of those fit me. So again, and that's incredible that that's happening. It's progress. But I'd like to push us farther, or further, whichever word it is there, and look at what else is outside the box. because I don't exist well in a box, and I know other people who also don't exist well in a box, and so I've been thinking about adding, that to my signature, and I couldn't figure out what to put because, well, quite frankly, I don't have preferred pronouns. I answer to he, I answer to she, I answer to her, I answer to him, I answer to they, and so I think I've been leaning towards using they, them, there, or whatever. But I was honestly afraid that people would think I was being sarcastic. But I'm not. I don't fit with either one, and I'll answer to all of the above. And so that's really important for me. Sexual identity doesn't exist as a binary. You're not one or the other. There are so many in-between places that we can exist, or for some of us, exist over time in different places on that continuum, as we heard in Carlos's story. I have a similar story of being married to a man. Now I'm married to a woman, but the woman that I'm married to is only a woman biologically because she also identifies as pangender, and it's just more complicated, like the student was pointing out. It's not a linear thing. And the only thing I would add to that, because I'm sure I've already taken more than my share of time on this question, is gender-inclusive restrooms are incredibly important. Not just for me. It's my emotional discomfort when I deal with those issues on this campus and off of this campus. But there are people who deal with very serious physical safety issues as a result of gendered restrooms. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Melissa.
I'd like to just say something about the intersection of class and hierarchy and academia, because that's huge in this discussion, and it's been talked about just barely. I was having a discussion just earlier in this space about the new faculty reception, but new faculty is only new faculty who are tenure track. So there are new faculty who are part-time that aren't included in what is called new faculty. There might be issues that need to be addressed where, whatever it might be, restrooms or names or pronouns, or why is it that that part-time faculty pay for parking permits out of their, at every semester, and full-time faculty get to, have that taken out of their check, and so there's not a big chunk. And the folks that are part-time, there's a class income difference. They're the least able to be able to do that, but that's where that burden falls. And how are those folks going to go and advocate for that when, if I'm going to go talk about that issue, and all of the rest of my identities are then become an issue, an understated issue, perhaps for the person who might be in that decision-making, or even hearing the issue and deciding where that can be appropriately addressed. And all of the decision-making processes and groups, the majority of which, academic senate and so forth, all of those participatory kinds of things are very structured and limited to maintaining this hierarchical us and them. And being a faculty member in women's studies, where our ideologically it is about challenging those hierarchical power structures as they are, and yet the institution there's this It's much as Dakota mentioned earlier with religion, and not being able to extricate those. Our multiple identities are inextricably intersected. It's not one thing or the other ever. It's always both and, multiple and it's even the intersection. When we think about intersectionality, and it's this point of cross, and then the trajectory is still going here, and it's really more of a compounding of identities all collectively. And so at that intersecting point, there's this and this interweaving, overlapping connectedness, because they can't be pulled apart. So there isn't a separate trajectory. There was a point of intersection, and I'm going to today be black, tomorrow be queer, the next day be a woman, the next day be, no. 24/7, that's who I am. And I'm also, you know, I have people, you've been here how long, and did you just start? Well, no, but I'm not included. My name isn't even on the directory. If you look me up, and I've been here since 1999. I'm not in the faculty and staff directory. And I brought that up several times, but are you? No, I'm full-time actually, but so it, and how do you?
I discovered that when I was trying to find you.
Right.
Right.
I've had many people try to find, well, I can't find you. Are you sure you're legitimate? I think so. Yeah, last time I checked, yeah, I'm real, yeah, bench. But absolutely, I've had people tell me that many times, and I've tried to change it.
Thank you. Carlos?
The way how I'll answer this is, as a therapist and as a counselor, I always like to know people, like to hear their stories and see how their experiences have shaped them. I know that my experiences have had many twists and turns, but I don't regret any of that. I wouldn't undo any of that. It's brought me to this moment. You know, I don't like talking in public. I'd rather do it one-on-one, and the fact that I'm doing this shows a lot of change in me and growth that I'm really happy about. But one of the things that I would encourage you, you know, if you have students, if you have individuals that you want to know more about, get to know them on a personal level. We all have our stories. We all, you know, have something that we can contribute. And so, yeah, that's all I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And John?
If it's okay, I would defer to Dr. Garber, who, are we going to have reflection from
Yes.
Dr. Garber? Because
Yes.
I'd love to hear her reflect upon us. So.
All right. So we will bring up Dr. Garber. This is Dr. Linda Garber, and she comes here from Santa Clara University, and at one point she worked here also, so she's been here and there and everywhere. And Dr. Garber, if you could come up and share some of your thoughts about what you've heard, and also if you want to think about that last question.
As she walks to the microphone, I would just like to give her props. Dr. Garber hired me, and thank you for that. And I just have been many times very grateful for just people who do the right thing because it's the right thing. I was hired at a time when she offered me a 3-and-3 contract with benefits, and she said, "Do you want benefits?" And I went, "I don't really need them right now." I was married to a man, and just she didn't have to do that, and that it wasn't required, and it wasn't. I didn't know until much later that it wasn't normal, that there were other people who were hired at the same time, and they weren't offered benefits. It wasn't a regular thing. So doing the right thing because it's the right thing is a pretty awesome reality in her life all the time. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Well, if nothing else, I militate against the normal at every given opportunity. I've listened now and had the chance to reflect on the student panel and the faculty staff panel, both of which were asked the same questions. And I realized that I get away with doing that without identifying myself. And Julie asked me to address the last question, but I thought I'd address the first, which I will also be doing in the talk later, but I know that some people go to, you have the opportunity to go to some parts of today's events and not others. Thinking about how I identify is a situational question often for me, and that's one of the things that I was hearing from all of you in various ways. As I appear before you today, I think what you see is white and female and middle-aged and professional, and there's some queer part because that's what we're talking about today. You don't see other things that are also aligned with categories that are related to privilege and oppression. I'm Jewish. Culturally, I was raised religiously Jewish. I'm an atheist. There's contradiction there, isn't there? But there's not. I have a hidden disability. I want to apologize that I had dark glasses on. while you were all speaking, I get migraines, and it's very glary right now from the windows. And so to be able to focus and pay attention, I had to do this off-putting thing. So John, when you said you were curious to hear my reflections, I thought, well, you've been seeing your reflection in my dark glasses the whole time. You know, I could go on, and of course we all have identifying characteristics that are meaningful to us as well, that are not necessarily because of the way our society is organized in this place and time, right? The occasions or excuses for privilege or oppression. And I appreciate that all of you talked in various ways about the nuances of those identity categories and addressed the systematic nature and the institutional contexts of those oppressions and privileges and identity categories. Not surprisingly, as faculty, staff, and not always, but often older than the students. At least one of the students was a non-traditional age student. Had more time to think about the fluidity and nuances of those categories through our own experiences, through the people we've met and known. I'm hearing a lot today here, and also, of course, in the wider world and in the LGBTQ movement, the intersectional diversity movements, about fluidity around trans issues, around gendered pronouns and bathrooms. And I think that it is a wonderful topic for us, both, first of all, it's a necessary thing to address, but also an opportunity to think about fluidity and going beyond binaries in a number of ways. Dakota, you mentioned Stone Butch Blues. I first met Leslie Feinberg, the author, at what was then the feminist bookstore in the Tower District, talking about not Stone Butch Blues, but a book of essays, and was the first time that anyone encouraged me to think about myself as genderqueer. Now, I'm got this sort of femme thing going on a little bit. That's my professional drag sometimes, but I get called sir a lot. One of my favorite things to do when I'm teaching class is to, take off the scarf and the earrings and, I think I have colored lip gloss on, wipe that off and put on a sweatshirt and a baseball cap and say, see? So while I don't identify as trans, I identify as cis and a woman, cisgendered, I do identify as gender nonconforming in a lot of ways, and have been, have gained a vocabulary and a way of thinking about myself and myself in relation to others, and the preconceptions of women's and gender studies and sexuality studies by a new language that's being offered to all of us through transgender activism, genderqueer studies, that I think is very helpful in giving us new perspectives and new language for thinking about diversity in its nuances and fluidity in general. Right, that these categories are never just one thing. Melissa talking about, we think we have categories about race, and then of course there are differences, whether we're talking about colorism, whether we're talking about which Latino community is the community of home, and that the more we discuss our differences and the ways we approach them and what we need, I find that I learn about myself and about others as well. And I've been thinking about this because as I prepared my comments for later about intersectionality, which I know in front of however many people I will also say at some point intersexuality, because that's another category that we haven't yet been talking about. But about intersectionality, that we used to talk about similar issues in terms of coalition. And I think it was Melissa who you were just talking about intersectionality gets us to the points of intersection, but there may be some other metaphors that are useful too. And while you were speaking, I thought, well, maybe a meaningful one right now that I'll make use of is the image of confluence, right? As you say, as we're going down that path, right? Tributaries come together, and then there's a flow that is a sort of mix of things. So there's that kind of intersection, the coming together as well, and they go together, they go forward together, sometimes distinctly, but also in connection with one another. I heard the resonances of so many different important movements going on right now. John, I think you mentioned earlier, but Melissa's comments made me think of the hashtag what a professor looks like, or this is what a professor looks like. I don't do Twitter, but it's one of those two. And it's a lot of people who aren't, elbow patchy white men posting pictures of themselves, right? Who are we within this educated professional group on university campuses? What does that have to do with class? What does that have to do with race and age and gender identity and all sorts of things? Of course, we've been talking about language and trans issues. We've been talking about gender and sexual identity, and a little bit about disability and needs for accommodations in a lot of different ways. I mentioned a hidden disability, which is a chronic condition related to migraines. We have sign language interpreters. We have people talking about disability in terms of learning style and ADHD. And I feel like I want to go back to your question about, I don't have an answer for how do you succeed in a linear academy with what is actually a more organic, I think for a lot of people, non-linear approach. I could use different metaphors, but the ways in which university education is a kind of forced assimilation process, right? What do you have to do to succeed here, and what are the forms for succeeding? Well, if I had answers for all of this, you would have invited me as your first speaker, and then we would have been done. We wouldn't have needed President's Commission on Diversity. In fact, I think it was one of the students earlier who said she learned some time ago that when the words diversity and inclusion get mentioned a lot in mission statements and what have you, it's because we don't have those things. We haven't accomplished it yet. But I'm very encouraged, as I said earlier, by the increase in not just programming, but conversation and education at Fresno State. I was last taught here 15 years ago, and I see some of the same veterans in the crowd, and then I'm encouraged to see a lot of new faces and be meeting people I haven't met before at Fresno. And to see, and to speak about class hierarchy again, to see this happening at the president's level in the fancy meeting room where we had, the really good steak for dinner last night and all of that, to go from fighting for resources as the chair of women's studies to being invited back as the presidential speaker. Now, I'm also aware that that doesn't mean that women's studies is now getting the resources that it needs. So there is institutional work to be done, but I want to just end by saying I'm just so pleased and honored to be invited to be part of this community of people who are doing the work here. So thank you all.